I want to know from you, Whitney, what's your evolution of race consciousness?
Yeah, so I grew up in Seattle, Washington. Seattle, it's a well, when I grew up, it was a very white city, but I did grow up in a pocket of diversity. And I grew up in a middle class neighborhood, two middle class Black parents, from Chicago and Philly. And I saw a lot of people that looked all sorts of ways, all sorts of colors, spoke many languages. I grew up in one of the more diverse zip codes in the United States. Um, so I say all that to say, I didn't recognize any hierarchy until probably high school. And the reason is because in, no, that's not true. I didn't recognize hierarchy until middle school. And my introduction to the hierarchy was sexualization of my Blackness. That was when I started so the elementary school that I went to was very, very diverse. And of course, it was elementary school. So, like, everybody has crushes on everybody, but like the people that you were crushing on or were crushing on you back looked similar to you, or, there wasn't a race thing. It wasn't like this exotification of Blackness. In seventh grade, I started going to a school that I actually loved. It was a lot of fun. Wasn't great for education, but it was fun for I don't know, the teenager, the preteen that wanted to be in and like going to the parties.
You were getting
And
a certain kind of education, eh?
yeah, I was getting a certain kind of education. I only went there for a year. I got kicked out at the end of the year. And so at any rate, I was starting to attract a lot of attention as being a pretty Black girl, basically. And that school was still diverse. And strangely enough, it wasn't necessarily people at the school, but the neighborhood that the school was in, I had to go through a whole bunch of whiteness to get there. It was like in a poor area of North Seattle that had some diversity. But between where I lived in South Seattle and this place in North Seattle, I went through like a bunch of rich white areas. And it would be like in the travel to the school and back that I would encounter glances or stares. And that's when I started to realize that I was different. And that my race, my skin color, meant something, not necessarily a hierarchy, but just that it meant something. In high school, I played sports and was a very good athlete, medaled for state sports and track, played soccer, was very active. And I noticed my race there. I went to a mostly white, well, all white Catholic school, also in a different part of North Seattle, but this part of North Seattle was more affluent. Um, and that was my first time having like white boyfriends. And the white boyfriends were fine, but their parents were not. And one gentleman, not gentleman, he was a boy. One boy in particular, he was great. He was kind, he was fine. But he struggled dating me because of his parents' disapproval. And that was one of the first times that I think I was aware of Blackness not meaning a good thing. And that oddly, maybe not oddly, maybe very normally, came at the same time that I was kind of the Black token athlete, one of the Black token athletes at this school. So I'm walking down the hallways, people are familiar with me. Um, I'm one of maybe 10 in the entire school. I have a twin sister, so she's always, we're always together. Um, and we were other, but I wouldn't say that we were like treated badly or anything like that. It was just kind of awkward. Uh, So I was dealing with that awkwardness, being tokenized by like, teachers and by news media who was featuring me as like, the athlete at this white school. Um, and then had some weird encounters with parents who had issues, or like parents on sidelines of soccer matches, or referees at soccer matches who were treating me different. Um, what I can only assume at the time and still now was because of my race. Um, so I went to college in Northern Washington, also very white. And that is where I started learning more about like what race meant. And I'll say in ninth grade is when 9/11 happened. Um, so race itself became much more a part of my life after 9/11, seeing how whiteness interacted with non-white, not necessarily or specifically blackness, because of course it wasn't blackness, it was people of, Middle Eastern descent, Iraqis, Persians, stuff like that. But brown skin, I became aware of brown skin and of this fear that white people had around brown skin, and this indoctrination that we were experiencing no matter our skin color because 9/11. So I go to college, and college is where I feel tired of being the only Black person. And I found a community there in college. I'm also, I came out as bi. I think I'm really more like pansexual. I don't really care like what you got going on. I care about you type of thing. I found a group of like queer people of color at this college and started to study with them and started to hang out with them, started to smoke weed with them, started to just like be with them. And in that being, started like kind of philos, philos, talking. I'm just gonna say talking. Started talking.
Philosophizing, perhaps.
Right, right. About this thing of race and what it meant for us, what it meant for us and me as a Black woman, what it meant for things like medical care, what it meant around tokenism, what it meant around like being an athlete and being kind of like masculinized, if you will, as an athlete. Like I wasn't really thought of in some spaces as like, a dateable woman type of thing. Um, and really pushing up against that box and like trying to embrace my femininity off the field or off the track. Um, and so I think from there, I just continued to develop in terms of my understanding on what oppression was, what that looked like, what that meant. And it kind of went from there. So that was a very long-winded answer.
No,
But I
no, no,
think
no, no. We're here
that's where
for
it started.
we're here for long-winded answers. So like that's part of the reason it's 2-hour
Right,
conversations because
right.
we need that time. But no, I appreciate that answer.
I was just thinking about this other dynamic, which is the story that I'll speak for myself. I grew up with as a Black girl, young woman, and now woman, that racism looks a certain way. And that from everywhere, like from all sides, again, I grew up with the being called an Oreo, Black on the outside, white on the inside. Because my experience was not necessarily like the stereotypical Black person that's shown in TV, and not, I mean, yes, in terms of the poverty, in terms of the Ebonics, the vernacular, the way that we speak, the way that we dress, the way that the music, blah, 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 but also from the Black or POC perspective, from the racism that I should be experiencing. Like, it's kind of like I was questioning myself, like, am I experiencing some bullshit? Because it sure doesn't look like a shop owner following me around a store. I mean, like, I can't say that I've noticed that. I'm sure it's happened, but I can't say that I've noticed it. Like, I, until adulthood, hadn't been called colored, or inward to my face at least. I hadn't, been threatened, so I just didn't have some of the experiences that I was looking for in terms of like the category of racist hate. And I think that that's one of our issues as a society as well, that white supremacy perpetuates. In addition to the racism and all that stuff was in the past, and now we're post-racial. In addition to that narrative is the narrative of, if it's not in your face, if, shoot, a white officer can be on your neck with their knee and it could still not be racism. So it's like when you're growing up in this skin, and some of the stuff is so subtle. Some of the stuff, microaggression right now is a buzzword, and it's a word that, we're all learning, and microaggressions are real, gaslighting, all this stuff. They're all buzzwords because I feel like that's how I experience racism. It's not people coming up to my face saying something, spitting on me, doing what it's, throwing a rock at me, putting a burning cross on my lawn. It's subtle stuff, questioning everything asking me, why does it always have to be about race? Because I'm Black. What do you mean? Because it is always about race. It's only not always about race when you are not on the bottom of the hierarchy. Because race serves you, but race doesn't serve me. And so it's, navigating all of that. It's very confusing. I think you're the first person that I've talked to that's like talked about the confusion, like, so kind of in a spot on way. I think we talk about confusion a lot as adults, like in terms of the gaslighting, but not as we are growing up in the confusion.
That's
and
one thing
like
I
trying
always
to
talk
make
about.
sense of how can it be in the past, but I'm experiencing this? How can we be post-racial, but I'm experiencing this? But, all of the statistics, the racial wealth gap, the, people not, Black people not making as much money as white people, we can just, the food deserts in Black communities, the education in communities of color, and not to mention Indigenous communities. Like, it's just, how can it be in the past and we live with these disparities?
And frankly, the answer to that is even more difficult to accept and to kind of navigate, because it becomes, at least for me, it became obvious that inspiring or motivating or perpetuating willful ignorance is a part of a system of white supremacy. And if you learn the history of white supremacy, that's what you learn, is that promoting ignorance goes all the way back to making sure Black people didn't know how to read, making sure white people never saw the deplorable conditions and treatment that Black slaves were enduring, and that one of the reasons that a lot of white people's hearts were actually swayed was because they did eventually see that at different points in U.S. history. And it's interesting though. Just understanding those ebbs and flows throughout the course of this, racial hierarchies history. It's been interesting. The 9/11 thing you mentioned. Actually, a lot of people on my podcast have talked about 9/11 and how that kind of opened their eyes a little bit more to white supremacy. And similarly, a lot of people talked about how COVID did that. And how a lot of the Asian hate from calling it the China virus and, this and that. And people who were in a community with racialized Asian people started finding out that, oh, wow, this can be like a light switch. It can be turned on and suddenly you're no longer as safe as you once were. And so, yeah, I think that these pivotal events, George Floyd obviously is another one with the advent of BLM and whatnot. We can't, in my opinion, continue to allow bloodshed and death to be what inspires us to do something about these problems. And that's another reason why I'm actively and intentionally and consciously spending my time and energy creating this space and doing this work, because we can know I mean, this continuous cycle of Black death inspiring anti-racism, this is this mechanism for me is like totally inadequate and depressing and not necessarily inspiring and reactionary, and none of the things that we need, I think, in order to make revolutionary changes to our racial system at this time, which I think is past time. But like now, with the advent of technology, with the way our rule of law is breaking down and our political system is breaking down, we must take this issue more seriously, or we're going to move backwards. And I think people are already starting to see that a little bit with laws against teaching about race and racism in various states, with laws that are meant to protect against discrimination about against Black people, like the Texas student who had the dreadlocks, who's been kept out of his high school, and then the law is not even protecting him, even though that's why it was written. I mean, we have these situations, and we're seeing that we're still in a fight. And I think a lot of people, they don't want to acknowledge that, because there has been a modicum of improvement and change in our society in terms of like, we have freedom to do things that we were once by law prohibited from doing. So in that regard, there's that. But in terms of race and racism and the impacts that it has, a lot of the impacts, they're identical. So if we're going to change that, if we're going to give Black youth a better experience and a better environment in which to grow up in, where they can be proud, where they don't have to worry about whether someone's going to see them for the person that they actually are, or whether they're just going to see a Black criminal, then we got to be more aggressive about it. And we can't let all these people who come out here with their little podcasts talking about racism is over, or talking about victim mentality, or talking about democratic plantation. We can't let these people dictate our racial experience and what we're going to do in a racialized world. So that's my perspective on it. What do you think?
I don't disagree at all. So many things went through my head. If I would have been smart, I would have had a pen and notepad like you do. I think you said we can't, well, I'll just say what I heard because I can't rephrase, but that our revolution can't be because of Black death, because of racist violence. And yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree that like reactions are not going to be as strong, or not going to be as deliberate, not going to be as strategized as proactive planning, which I think is what we need. Like that's where the education, that's where the coalition building, that's where the community building, that's where the policy, that's where the laws, all of that stuff um, can and should be proactive. What I've been struggling with recently, though, is hearing one of my colleagues. So I'm a DEI consultant as well. Kind of call myself an equity and access consultant, dealing mostly with race. And one of my colleagues said in a training a couple of weeks back, something around like, for white people, making race and no, making anti-racism personal, taking anti-racism personally, and taking racism personally. I thought that was so powerful, because how? How do the very group of people who benefit from racialization take it personally, like take the threat of and the harm of racialization personally. And like, on the one hand, being a human and being a Black human, it's like, well, it ain't that hard. Like, just care about people, like that's like, on the one hand, is the just care about people. On the other hand, it's the recognition that they literally have never had to in the way that we're talking about. So, one, getting, interest in doing that. And how do you do that without somebody dying or without violence? And two, teaching somebody a whole new way of being in a way that is not reactionary, in a way that is not where they're coming to the table because they feel so bad about the guilt that they're now experiencing because of whatever the violence or the harm or whatever it was is. I think obviously there are people like that. I know lots of white people, and it's frankly not just white people. So whiteness, I'm just going to call it whiteness. And I say that fully intending to include people of color who also have internalized white superiority and white supremacy. So, like, how do we effectively have, like, make the transitions that we need to make in terms of growth and education and understanding and all of that stuff, and humanity and empathy and all the things without death and violence, without without death and violence, but also with full recognition and transparency that will mean sharing power, which means giving up power. Like,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So it's like those two. What human wants to do that? I just think it takes a special human, and I think the humans that have done that are special. And I know I don't want to like glorify these people. I just mean to say that I agree with you, and I'm not convinced that we can actually do that, even though I'm trying. Even though, like, I very much care about education, the educational component. I very much care about having cross-racial conversations because I think that the way forward is by working together. I don't think like Black people can create an actually equitable United States, let alone world, without the dominant group. But for me, it's so huge. It's like there's such a deficit of, maybe it's experience, because that's what they're reacting to, right? Or at least that's what I think they're reacting to. When there is reaction, it's because for some reason, this racial violence has caused them to feel like they're experiencing something. So how do we get some kind of experience that's going to be enough to shift? And I think we have to be really creative. And I've heard of some really creative things. I'm involved in some creative things like retreats and tours and AI and, all sorts of really cool virtual reality, all sorts of really cool tools. But I think that's what we're up against.
Yeah.
It's like, to not be reactionary, to be proactive, there has to be a little bit more skin in the game. But like, I don't think white sees the benefit in that.
I think you're exactly right. We talk about it all the time on this show. Everything you just talked about, that was wonderful, by the way. And okay, there's another wrinkle too, right? Because it's not just the lack of needing to do it. It's not just the lack of being encouraged to do it or having space to do it. It's also that if you do it, you will receive punishment, severe punishment. And most of them know that. Most of them somehow, some way have an idea that that is the result. Whether they want to consciously think about it or not, like, it's the same as the feeling that we get when white supremacy is bearing down us, but maybe indirectly. They get that same feeling if they start turning towards an anti-racist point of view. And so the reason why there's that divide is because for us, we have no choice but to keep going. Because again, it's based on our survival and success. For them, their survival and success is based on not doing that. So they are literally situated in an opposite way of us in that regard. The question that we were kind of talking about is these kind of racial divides that exist in terms of how people experience the racial hierarchy and how people react. And because of our situation, which is we're situated differently based on our racial category, we have different life experiences based on that. And because of those different life experiences and because of the different ways in which we interact with the hierarchy, our decision making in terms of whether to be anti-racist or not, it's not on the same plane. We're not making the same choices for the same reasons, but we all need to somehow get there. And so what I really want to do ultimately and what my goal is, and this is a broad goal, but I do believe that the United States needs to take on anti-racism as a value of the country. Right. Yes. I see your skepticism there. Because obviously, why would the United States ever do that? I think the answer to that is, they're not going to, right? So the government will not. The government is like probably the biggest supporter of white supremacy in history. So
have to be.
Yeah. So we're going to have to, I do believe it's going to be more and more difficult for the government not to accept anti-racism as a value the more our individual citizenry decides that it's something that needs to occur. And I actually think that at this point in human history and the country's history, that it's much easier than ever before to make that a reality in terms of like a critical mass of people who believe that and who are willing to act on that as a value for their country. It may not seem that way given the way everything is going right now and what everything looks like, but I just think we're on the cusp of the greatest opportunity we've ever had to promote anti-racism as a value of the United States. Like this is the final battle in terms of the way that I'm looking at it. Either we're going to rise from here or we're going to fall really far. And so for me, like, I was like, all right, I see it. I see the challenge. I'm ready to take it on. And in my opinion, the way we have to take it on is really heavily informed by the conversations I've had on this show. Because a lot of racialized white people report that the thing that made them more willing to act, be more willing to open to examine themselves and to make the tough decision to embrace anti-racism as a way of life and to modify their way of life to kind of be more anti-racist was being in greater community with people of color. That's the number one thing, right? So that's the number one thing. The number one thing is...
Yeah, learn that we don't suck.
Yeah.
People.
Like, oh my God. Like, yeah. This Black person, I love them, and you're talking about them like this, and this is not acceptable to me because I love this person, right? Or like, I now have a biracial granddaughter. This daughter is so precious, you know. I have this person in my life, I can't accept these racist people saying things about her. She's innocent. She doesn't deserve this. Now I see a little bit more, right? So it's having people. Yes, exactly. When it becomes personal, right? And oftentimes, you know, and this story recurs a lot. It's like white parents who have adopted Black kids, they come to the group and they talk about, their fears and whatnot. There's people who are like, oh yeah, I dated a black woman for the first time and then I started seeing all this stuff, right? So being in community with people of color is a blinder removal, right? It removes the blinders that white supremacy has put on you, or it can anyway. And it's highly effective. And it often makes it easier for people to act because they feel more like they're fighting for themselves. Okay? So that's one thing.
Okay.
The other thing is a lot of racialized white people particularly, there is no space for them to talk about this. So it's not that like they necessarily don't want to, but where do they? A lot of people can't talk about it with their families. A lot of people, they don't talk about it with their friends because why, right? Mostly people have friend groups, like you were lucky. I was lucky to have a diverse friend group, but a lot of people are not lucky in this country to have that. So who's going to inspire these conversations? Who's going to catalyze these conversations, right? And then, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I do want to just interrupt for just a second to say it's purposeful not having a diverse friend group. And I don't want to give people an out by saying that they weren't lucky, because if you wanted to find somebody, you could. If you can sexualize an Asian woman, a Indian woman, a black woman in some chat room somewhere, then you can go find one of them that's just a friend.
I totally agree with that. I agree that, like, I'm not trying to take away anyone's agency or choice, okay? But I also have to be realistic in the fact that, like, if you live in a 95% white community, then it is a different kind of choice to seek out a person of color to be friends with than if you're in a more diverse computer. It's the meaning of that choice is different. And it's unfortunate. It's not fair, and it's not, it doesn't humanize people to have that reality. But, like, I do think that's reality. I think it's, and I'm not trying to give anyone an out, but I just think that that's the reality of the situation. It's just like, I even I've heard a lot of racialized white people talk about, targeting people, like to try to make those connections, to try to build that community on purpose. But like that whole thought process of like deciding to do that, right? That's something that a lot of people, it's foreign to a lot of people. They don't even know why they should do it. Like there's no impetus to catalyze the process of even thinking that, much less doing it. So that's what I'm trying to get at, is that like, yeah. I'm not trying to say that they don't have agency. I'm trying to say that like, if you don't even know, that you need to do something, or that something might be beneficial for you or something, then how are you going to choose to do it? And I see the same thing in teaching people mathematics and writing as well. They just have never thought about something. And so when you bring that thought to the forefront, then they're like, oh, like I just never thought about that. Now that I know that, yeah, now this whole universe of choice, this whole universe of decision making that was not even in my mind open to me before that is now there. And so that is one of the goals of this show, is to try to create that universe of thought for people that didn't exist before. And I know I've been successful at it because I get feedback from people who listen to the show, from people who've been on the show. First of all, earlier in our conversation, you were like, I don't think I've ever talked to anyone about the confusion in that way. Almost everyone who appears on my show says something like that. Says, I never really thought about this, or I never really talked about it this way, or this or that. And the reason why is because, like, there are not enough spaces. There are not enough people involved in these conversations. And, like, I have to not give people an out, but I have to be sympathetic to that, because I understand what it means to be in a circumstance where you may have agency that you don't even realize.
Yeah.
And you may not know what your choices are. And so I just try to remember that I know a lot of people are in that situation, and it's, what can you do when you're ignorant? When you're ignorant, you're ignorant. That's what you are, until you're not. Once you're not, then you can make your choices, And so my goal is to put people to a choice. The choice that they may have already made. Maybe it was put to them and they made it and they forgot about it, right? But they're living by it. But I want to make those people reevaluate their choice. And I want people who have never made the choice to be anti-racist and to hold that as a value, a personal value, to think about accepting that as a personal value and then also promoting it as a value for the rest of the country. So yeah, that's my goal. I do think that it's a lofty goal that's kind of crazy, but ultimately we've got to start somewhere, and conversation is the start.
Thanks. I love that outlook. Like, we have to have lofty goals, because all the regular goals ain't doing nothing. Like, nothing. So, I mean, I like it, and I get, one of the things that I teach about as far as like debiasing ourselves is, exposure. So actually going and being around people of color or whoever you might have a stereotype or a bias against. And, stereotype replacement. So like we talk about it a lot as far as like sexism goes. A common analogy might be when you go to a mechanic, you think all mechanics are male, go to a female mechanic. So you think all doctors are white, go to a Black doctor. If you're a white person, go to a Black doctor. Go to, whoever. Replace what you think should like be seeking out somebody with a different identity than what you think you should be or what you would assume would be, the person in that role. Yeah, I mean, those two are great. I totally agree. And I love it when white people come to me, and I agree with you as far as not having necessarily a space for people to talk about it. I love that you have spaces where people can come. I am also starting that next week, having a white space and a BIPOC space for folks to come, because I do think, like I said at the outset, it takes all of us, not just one racial group. And also, I think it can be really harmful and dangerous to have cross-racial conversations at times. And I think that there do need to be spaces without other racial identities. I don't want to call them safe spaces. I think that that's a luxury and a myth. And what is safety when you're talking about race? But I do think that there are spaces where people can feel a little bit more comfortable. While I don't think it's not realistic to think that we're always going to be comfortable when we're talking about race, I do think that we need to be able to allow some comfort, some healing component, because otherwise it's just walking into a grinder. Like, that shit hurts. And if there's nothing, no aloe, no nothing that I can like put on this, then why is somebody going to come back? So ooh, I do. Yeah. I mean, all of what you're saying, I think is spot on. I hadn't thought about it on a political, frankly, I'm really, and so.
You kind of broke up for a second there, so I missed like the most pivotal thing you just said.
I'm really trying to hide from politics right now. And so like it's interesting for me to think about the United States making anti-racism a value. Like, I don't know who's going to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a radical idea that obviously is completely imaginary and doesn't exist. But like, yeah, I think the United States government and a lot of our state governments, I am involved in politics. I actually represented the largest state. I was the president of AAUP. It's called the American Association of University Professors. I was the state conference president for the state of North Carolina, where I live. So I was representing all higher ed faculty in my state at public universities and colleges. Mm-hmm. And what I saw with that experience, and a lot of other experiences I've had before that as well in politics, is there is a huge disconnect between people who are representing the people and the people.
And the actual people.
Yeah. I mean, the gap is like insane a little bit. Like, the conversations are totally distinct and disparate. And I'm like, so I was kind of, I obviously for me, I'm definitely the people. I've always been, I always will be. So I'm bringing some of those conversations that I'm having with people on the ground to these spaces. And let me tell you, the trauma of experiencing the responses and like the pushback and everything that happens when you try to do that and bridge these gaps, it is.
And especially in North Carolina.
Oh yeah, especially in this state. Yeah, this state is in big trouble. So yeah, it's very disappointing. It's very depressing. It's very hard to keep going and soldier on. But like, it does do some good, you know. And it's unfortunate, but we have to remember that this is a generations long problem. This is a generations long problem that is not going to be fixed tomorrow, you know, like, and it's not going to be fixed probably on my deathbed. So
Right. And that's what I mean, thinking about long term and the strategies that we need to take long term. But I think that we can get overwhelmed when we talk about long term strategizing. And that's why I brought up like anti-racism actions today, right this second, when we're observing, when we're taking part in conversations or dynamics or whatever, because that's how, I mean, it's, I've been reading a lot of Adrienne Marie Brown and, emergent strategy and fractals and starting small and duplicating and replicating, and it's spreading to the bigger thing. And I just feel like we individuals do have choices. We do have a role. There are things that we can do almost daily, unless we're staying at home under the covers. And so all of the things that we do are a part of a bigger strategy. But we do have to know what that strategy, like where we're going, why, what, because I will say, maybe it's not every situation that we need to say something. Maybe we don't have the energy. Maybe we don't care enough about this person. Maybe, there's lots of reasons why we might not say, why we might not intervene, why we might not interrupt a situation. And so we need to know for ourselves when to and when maybe not to.
Somebody who was recently on the show, a racialized white man who is a mental health professional. And he is someone who, as a racialized white man, had that rare opportunity to experience what Black people go through in unique ways through his close relationship with Black people. And he kind of was like, I want to show that as a therapist, as a mental health professional, that I'm not going to hurt Black people who come to me as a client. I'm going to be willing to listen to their racialized trauma and like, I'll be able to understand it. And he was like, I don't know how to like get that clientele and to get people to understand that like I'm out here and this and that. And I'm like, and it was interesting because he was saying that on the heels of telling me about a situation where he was being trained by someone at one of his jobs, and that guy was talking about Black clients in a negative way, openly, publicly, and he didn't say anything. Exactly what we were talking about earlier. And so I was like, well, a few things, right? Like, first of all, maybe you're not quite ready to take on those clients as you think if in that situation you felt like you couldn't say something, right? Like, it's one thing to, imagine yourself as doing something, but when you're in the moment and then you feel like there's nothing you can do, that's something you need to reflect on for yourself first, before you start trying to heal other people's mental trauma. Personally, I think that. But, and then the second part was, I was like, well, just tell people that. Tell people what you just told me. like set that up as something that when you have a new client, you let them know just directly.
Be explicit.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Use words.
Yeah. Just tell them and then execute and then act that out. Actually live the value that you are expressing that you have. That's all that it requires. Once you start doing that and people recognize you, then, the rest will follow.
Yeah. It's interesting, especially being down here. So in Seattle, I felt like other people of color were a little more trusting of white people. I don't know if that's actually true, but that's what it felt like. Down here in Georgia, People don't trust white people, and they have a lot of reason not to. And so I say that because I think when you're a white person and you are in a helping profession, you might need to go an extra mile or two to gain the trust. And you just got to stick it out until you get there. Because there's just a lot of mistrust. And even within my own community, like my close, tight knit community of people where I'm trying to show, like, I have a lot of close white friends who I do trust. And probably in my close group, maybe 10 friends, which that's kind of a big group, but it is what it is. I might be the only one that has like multiple close white friends. And it's not that people aren't nice, and not that they won't be friendly to white people. It's not any of that. It's just, I think, there's a deep rooted mistrust that people of color don't have the energy to experiment with.
I feel like I have 2 stories related to that I want to tell you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So, story number 1. My best friend, racialized white man, met him in college. My mom still remembers him to this day because he jumped on my bed in my dorm room, and my mom was like, really? Like, we're just coming in? And so she always remembers that. But yeah, this guy, we just really hit it off. It's funny. He's raised pretty conservative, military family, this and that, which interestingly enough kind of stops some of the racial messaging from entering him because he lived all around the world.
Yeah.
So, that's led to some funny conversations and interesting ones. But, we had been friends for years at the time this story takes place. And we're like standing and we're waiting for a train or something. And I can't even remember exactly what the conversation was, but I remember him saying something. And what he said revealed that he had no concept at all of what it meant for me to exist as a black man in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we have been friends for years. I mean, we've been through thick and thin. This dude saved my life. We've been through everything. And all of a sudden, I was coming face to face with the reality that, he had no clue. Not a clue. And I was just like, oh, my God. What does that mean about our friend? What is that?
Are we even friends?
Exactly, because I was
Who is this stranger?
How can
I let
we
him in my house.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, it didn't go that far, but it was like, what the heck? If this is the reality, what is all these experience? It made me look at our relationship totally differently. And, he was totally oblivious to it all. For him, it was like nothing happened, right? But I'm sitting there having an existential crisis, being like, oh my God, this is my best friend, this is what I call this person, my best friend. And so, it kind of gave me some insight into how we can just go through our lives, right? And not bring the issue of race or racism to the forefront pretty easily. And we can go through so many different contexts without it coming up. And that's exactly what we did. We joked about it, when we were younger. I remember when we were in undergrad, during my orientation week, we're already best friends at this time already. And somebody else comes up to me and they're like, oh, what part of Africa are you from?
Oh.
And I was like, oh. And so I'm telling my friend Matt about this, and he thought it was hilarious. He wrote a poll and sent it out to everybody in the dorm. What part of Africa is Will from? And he put these choices. And at the time, we both were cracking up. The Congo, by the way. But yeah, I mean, that is as far as we got. We were very surface level. We were joking about the racism. We were joking about stuff like that. I had a person from the Office of Minority Affairs from the university come, and I humiliated this person publicly because they were trying to help me. And I was still totally programmed to believe that oh, like I don't need special help because I'm black. Why would you think I need that? Blah, 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 all this stuff, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, just like going through these experiences. Now, what did I do, right? I invited my friend Matt to be the moderator of this show. And he was the first moderator of this show. And but through observing my conversation with guests, through us having our own conversation, he's also appeared on the show twice. He it didn't only impact him in terms of like learning more about race and our racial environment, but it also had a material impact on his actual life separate from me. He
Mm-hmm.
has a supervisor who is a racialized black man, and he took it upon himself to talk about race with his supervisor, and it turned into a 90-minute conversation one day they had at work. And that conversation transformed him, and it transformed their relationship both personally and professionally in a positive way. And he talked all about that. And I think that that outcome of it having positive, yielding positive results is just something that's outside of the imagination of most racialized white people. Because why would you
Yeah.
think that like going down this road would yield something positive? Like it's just outside of their experience, right? Or anything that they observe. So,
Yeah, well, and that the generation before us, like I feel like we are okay, so civil rights movement, everybody's talking about race. Okay. Then it becomes rude to talk about race. And color blindness was today's anti-racism. So I think also now the adults, my age, I'm 36, were raised by parents who learned that it was rude to talk about race, to acknowledge race like directly, to say, "Hi, I'm Whitney, I'm black." Of course I would never say that, but like
yeah.
it kind of like your relationship with Matt and how you guys became so close but never directly like talked about race. Like I've had that one of my good friends, Sasha, now we talk about race, and we have been talking about race for probably 10 years. But the first 5 years we lived together, did not talk about race. She's white, I'm black, she's great, I love her, all the stuff. But it just kind of was like, well, you can see that I'm black, I can see that you're white. Like, what else is there to talk about type of thing? But the trust, like, so my close white friends, well, okay, every white person in my life has talked about race with me at this point. Um, because I'm that person that will just talk. I
Me
I will
too,
definitely
Whitney.
say, oh,
Me
that
too.
happened because I'm black.
Me too. Yes,
Or
I
that
hear
happened
you.
because right, like I will somebody ask me how I'm doing. I'm like, oh, I'm not doing too good because I heard about some racist shit that happened. Like so. But anyways, my closest white friends are people where we have earned trust with each other by having difficult conversations about race, and difficult and as insofar as uncomfortable, not difficult insofar as you did a racist thing and now I'm going to call you in. That actually has very rarely happened with like my close, because like I'm already friends with like the good white people, so like, but it's still needing to have conversations that just acknowledge that I'm a racialized black person and you're a racialized white person, which means we have different experiences, which means I'm impacted one way by one thing and you might be impacted another way by another thing, and we cannot just assume that we walk through life the same. So let's check in. How When I say how are you doing today, I mean how are you doing? I mean sexism, racism, ableism, I mean homophobia, I mean all the things, and you're free to tell me how you're doing, and vice versa. Um, and back to my point about like the mistrust, I think a lot of people of color, well, people general, white people too, who are not in this movement or in this kind of space feel like they don't have the energy, and they don't have like they're not invested in that way, and not that they don't want liberation, but it is an investment.
It's a
It's an
sacrifice.
emotional,
It's a
energetic
sacrifice.
investment.
Mm-hmm.
And not everybody has that at any time. I certainly don't have it all the time. Um, and so I just think that it's interesting, and so this white man who you had on the show, that's great. Like great that he wants to be that person. But I think too that we just have a way to go with white people in helping professions, because helping professions were never meant to help us. And the systems are still set up in a way that aren't supposed to help us. So not only, like, there's just so much there. Like, you got to go
Layers
out
and
of your
layers.
way to
Oh
make
yeah.
this successful for us.
Yeah. And people, and it's daunting to a lot of people once they realize that, right? Like, and that's why I said, you said investment, but I like the word sacrifice, because like it is like, you will sacrifice if this is your choice. There's no getting around it. There's no beating around the bush. Like, that is a reality of that choice. And, I think that for anyone in any context who has to decide to make a sacrifice, that requires a lot of self-reflection, and it requires like a passion and strong values, right? And these are the things in the race context that people have not developed. They've not developed strong values in general. I know I did it. I didn't develop strong values about race until I was older, right? Until I learned more, until I
Right.
connected what I learned to my own personal experience, And so we just need to understand that that is a process that takes time. It's a process that takes time. But when I think about why I'm hopeful about the future, it's because I feel like no one has really been trying to catalyze that process for real. Like, most of our actions have been about trying to gain civil rights, right? Like, the civil rights
Yeah.
movement was about allowing us to be able to move freely, to work freely, to exist,
So,
trying to exist at the same level of humanity as our fellow citizens. Um, and so once that occurred, I think a lot of people, there's that Dr. King quote. As I said, we're reading Dr. King in our book club right now. Please join us, guys, in the Discord. But there's that one quote where Dr. King said he realized that racialized white people, they were looking for an end to brutality. They were not looking for equality for black people. So, it was the violence, it was the brutality that was worrisome for them, not the lack of equality that black people experienced in our lives. And so it's that disconnect that we're still dealing with today, right? George Floyd, everybody watches the life get choked out of him, right? And so, yes, that inflames everybody's passions because it shows, a lack of humanity. And that dehumanization, witnessing it, has constantly, as we talked about earlier, been a catalyzation of anti-racist action, right? BLM in this case, the marches, like the promotion of legislation that never got passed, so all of these things. But again, it just shows, right, that these sacrifices of black blood, they are limited in the in the way that they can advance racial justice.
interesting.
Yeah, we can't, and it's something that I try to bring up all the time because we just cannot allow this to be the thing that catalyzes racial justice, like a push for racial justice. And I feel like we're always just waiting for the next tragedy, waiting for the next
Well,
tragedy. Yeah,
yeah, and by your logic, it won't even work because we need white people, but white people are only responding to the violence, to the brutality, to the dehumanization. They're not responding to the fact that we, as people of color, just have less value. They're not responding to the racial hierarchy.
precisely.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, they're not responding to the racial hierarchy. And that's because a lot of racialized white people don't know enough about it. They really do not understand the history of it. They don't understand how it came into being. They don't understand why it's still perpetuated today. There is no connection between past and present for a lot of racialized white people in the race context. And so that's where we're at. Unfortunately, until we change that, we're not going to get racialized white people on board because it makes sense, right? It's not even something they can imagine. Our reality isn't something a lot of racialized white people can imagine. And so, yeah, we just got to start here, which is bridging that gap of our separate realities into one. And it starts with conversation. It starts with a conversation. This is another thing that I've noticed when I talk to racialized black people about the subject of race. Like, the conversation is just radically different, which like makes sense, obviously, but like I just want to point it out because I think you mentioned it earlier a little bit, or like kind of touched on it, which is there needs to be spaces for people who are racialized the same to talk with each other about this subject matter. And then there needs to be places where people can come together and talk about their disparate racialized experiences. I always just am so filled with just joy and hope when I have these conversations with Black people, because the lack of not being understood, like, first of all, that just, it's a relief. The hearing other people mirror your thoughts on the subject matter, that's something that doesn't often happen outside of racial categories in this context. So it gives me hope. It gives me joy. It makes me feel like I'm not alone. And I just appreciate you for being here and giving me that. I really do.
Yeah. I mean, I've loved this conversation. I'm really excited for you to come on Impostrix Podcast, because I what am I? It is, I mean, well, I guess exactly what you just said, as far as mirroring each other in outlook. And your ideas really excite me, or maybe it's just the way the frame, the lens that you put on it, I think is really exciting. And has certainly left me feeling more hopeful, even as I do this work, and thinking about the grand plan.
That is great feedback to have. That's why I do this work partially. So thank you, Whitney. It's just a pleasure to meet someone else who's trying to do the work. It always is. I've met Black women who are doing all kinds of amazing work in education, in law, in AI, in tech, in tax, in housing, in policy. Just incredible work, and y'all are amazing, frankly.
We are.
And yeah, just like legit. And so anytime I can get Black women on the show to talk about the work that they do, it's a privilege for me to be able to platform you guys. And if there's anyone else you know of, please let me know whose work needs to be platformed and shared with the general population. I would love to do that. Um, this is like a weird thing to bring up right at the end, but I kind of feel like Black women have a problem with me.
With you?
Yeah, for sure. 100%. I'm actually sure that that's the case. But like, I don't know if it's because I'm gay or if there's something else, but a lot of people have observed it. So it's not just me thinking it. There's definitely something.
Well, I hope nobody's observing anything right now. I got no problems with Will. Okay, I'm very
No, not
happy with
you,
Will.
not you. Clearly, you're here, and you are. I don't think it's you at all, but like, it is a common occurrence, like a weirdly common occurrence for me to get the cold shoulder by Black women in all kinds of different personal and professional contexts. Yeah, but anyways, I don't think. Maybe it's how catty you can come off as. Maybe it is. Am I catty? That's what somebody wrote in the chat. So, well,
I don't feel like you're cat. Maybe you're catty. I don't know.
yeah, I don't know either. It doesn't really bother me that much, because there's plenty of women like yourself who are perfectly cool with me. So it's all good. But maybe it's something we can discuss at a later date. But anyways, Whitney, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for taking 2 hours out of your life to have this conversation with me.